Hello, and thanks for joining me on Zulf Talks podcast, Working for Yourself. The podcast is powered by trustedcreators.org. I am Zulf. Hello, and welcome to the show. The title for this episode may be a little bit confusing, and it's something I try to play with to get a little bit more of a marketing spin on it and get a bit of intrigue in the topic. Is this M word the key to success? The M word being marketing. Coming from a different background, I've worked in the financial sector, and marketing there was slightly different, a little bit more like wash your mouth out with candy floss and what color is the cloud today kind of arena. But I've been listening to a podcast recently, and it kind of spins my theory on marketing, and I thought it'd be really good to speak more about this and understand why there's different types of marketing that can be interesting to you, depending on where you're working, what you're doing. So the podcast that I have been listening to recently is called Nudge, and we're lucky enough to have the guest on today. My guest being the host of Nudge. I reached out and dropped him a little message after signing up to his newsletter, and he had a little thing there saying, "You know what? Drop me a message. Make sure this email came through to you." And I was like, "Oh yeah, hello, thanks. Love your podcast. I want to have you on my podcast." And he replied. I was like, "Oh wow, okay, that'd be great to speak to him." And the host of Nudge podcast, he is also a senior product marketer at Buffer, and he takes insights from researchers, authors, and pioneers and condenses them into useful advice that anyone can use. I found these super helpful to change how I thought about marketing. And today we talk to Phil to understand more about the M word. Yes, the M word being marketing. Phil, welcome to the show.
Hey, Zulf, thanks so much for having me. And what a lovely intro. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, I normally say it off the top of my head sometimes, and I have little notes that I like to mention. But I think with you, it's quite easy because I listened to your podcast. I was like, you know what, that guy's doing something really amazing, and it'd be good to speak to him about how he does it. My first question is going to be slightly around marketing because there's different types of marketing. Do you have more interest in certain kinds? Because, like I mentioned in my example, I'm more from a financial background, like a business to business arena. And their marketing was a little bit more, it may be down to the leader. They obviously have different directions they take the department, but that was more like fluffy type stuff. But yours is stuff you can actually use after each episode. I'm like, you know what? I need to have a notepad with me, not write down
Mm.
some action points. So, can you tell me a bit about the different types of marketing, please?
Yeah, great question. I guess it's quite a controversial answer I've got here, which is that there are definitely lots of different types of marketing, but I believe there's sort of a universal theme which you can use to look at marketing and answer a bunch of questions. Obviously, a lot of us are taught about the different types of marketing. You've got marketing by the funnel. So you can have marketing at the awareness stage, consideration stage, acquisition stage, retention stage, and that being customer marketing. And then you've got marketing based on different types of use cases. So growth marketing, brand marketing, product marketing, content marketing, lots of different ways of describing marketing. And obviously there is then B2B and B2C, SaaS, high touch, low touch SaaS, all these different variations. And you can get bored just listening to me list them out. But my view, or at least what I found, is that despite there being all these different disciplines, despite there being all these different areas of expertise, I believe that ultimately with marketing, you are trying to influence people, individuals. And the best way to understand how to influence them, how to change their decisions, is to study the science of decision making, which is not a new thing. It is not as new as content marketing. It's a 2,000-year-old study of psychology and how we as humans make decisions. And by understanding that, you can better understand how to improve your marketing. And this is what I've found in sort of my past 5, 6 years studying consumer psychology and behavioral science. I've seen when you apply that to marketing, you get good results. So in terms of your questions, there are lots of different types of marketing, but I believe there are some universal themes which are very useful and could be applied to all of those different types of marketing.
Okay, so listening to one of your episodes, there's slightly a few things that I looked at and I thought, you know what, that's very different to how I understand marketing. What led you to get into the area that you talk about? So if you think about episodes and how you lay your podcast out, why do you talk about marketing in the way that you talk about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of a funny story. So I'm from the UK. I'm one of the unlucky folks that had to spend £50,000 £500 to get to university and has a huge debt, which I'm not even close to paying off. In fact, I'm not even sure I paid off the interest. I did that degree on marketing. So I spent 4 years studying marketing, all these different types of marketing, and it should have put me in incredible stead to go into my first job and be a very highly effective marketer. But what actually happened is I went into that job, and although I'd studied things like advertising, I'd studied messaging, I'd studied traditional marketing frameworks, I found myself in my first marketing job being really unable to effectively produce the things I was asked to produce. I was asked to write an email subject line. I didn't know how to make that more compelling and click-worthy. I was asked to write a blog post. I didn't know how to get people to read that. I was asked to write, I don't know, all sorts of things, help center articles, blog articles, advertising copy, all this stuff, and I wasn't very good at it. And this happened for sort of the first couple of years whilst I was working in marketing, and then I sort of stumbled upon the realm of consumer psychology and behavioral science. And when I sort of discovered that and started to apply that to my work, I started to get a lot of success. I was sort of introduced to it by a guy called Richard Shotton, who I did a lot of work with at my previous company. He wrote a brilliant book called The Choice Factory, which is a great entry book that you can read to get into behavioral psychology and marketing. And then from that, I've been really studying psychology, created the podcast called Nudge Podcast, and have been testing and applying psychology to marketing for the past 3-4 years.
Wow. Okay. Now it makes sense. Hearing that background story, I understand it. Because I think when you're put into an area where you need to actually do what you're teaching, you can teach it in a better way. So I found listening to you, I could understand that, okay, he's talking about a challenge there that I've faced. So for example, in yours, you were told to make a title. You had to find out what's the best way to do that. These smaller things, not many people talk about, because that's the nuts and bolts of getting the actual task done. So if we look around the access to marketing, so for example, bigger companies have budgets for marketing. They kind of had a full team of it. So a lot of our listeners on my podcast are small business owners, maybe setting up their own company, couple of employees, under 5 employees, or someone who's self-employed and they're just working for themselves. How can we get marketing to someone like that? So for example, they're not very good at marketing themselves, but they want to get someone in to do that. Is that a service we should look at? Is that something you currently offer, or how does it work?
So the question is how to sort of get marketing expertise on staff. It's a good question. I mean, look, fundamentally, if you're a small business owner, part of your role is a marketer. Like that's just part of it. And you're nodding along. I'm sure lots of other people will be nodding along. You know that it's not just about marketing. It's about actually selling your product, convincing people that your product or service is worthwhile, showcasing that you stand out in the market, showcasing that you're differentiated. I think maybe if you're a sole trade or a small business owner, trying to offload marketing as a whole category to someone else is a bad thing to do, because it means you're probably putting aside some crucial questions that you have to answer in order to make your business a success. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't offload some tasks which are more tactical. Repurposing this video into a TikTok reel or an Instagram reel is a worthwhile thing to do, and you might pay someone to do that. That is a form of marketing. But actually, like for you, Zulf, like you wouldn't want somebody else to come in and decide what's your positioning, how are you going to be differentiated in the market, what message are you going to share with your audience to make them want to keep listening and stick around. That's sort of things that has to be owned by a small business owner, even if they are limited on time. Because if you don't own that, if you don't understand that, you will struggle to grow your business, and offloading it to someone else, I don't think will help dramatically.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, because a lot of times you'll get someone plug themselves to say, okay, you should offload it to me and we can do it for you. But it can be interesting in this journey because, like you mentioned, something that I'm doing at a smaller level, I might want to share certain elements of my process in a different platform, and there's different ways of doing that. If you get another marketing professional on, they may look at it in a different way. You might have to upgrade things. It may not be the same goal or the message that you want to send out until you get that relationship with the person you're working with, where you know exactly what you want with each other. Now, this marketing side of things, there's different types of marketing. If you talk a little bit about distinctiveness and what that would mean, the importance of distinctiveness in marketing. Because when we're talking about products and showing it, like in my example, I'm doing it about working for myself. Somebody else may have an actual product. It's not necessary that we need to learn marketing. It might be the case that we listen to podcasts, we learn online, and the little bits of information that we find actually help us be better marketers. Like, for example, from your episode, I was listening to the one about where you did the B2B testing for the adverts, the Reddit advert, and how it did with a different title.
Yeah.
I've been doing Facebook ads, I've been doing Reddit ads, I've been doing TikTok ads. While I was during that process, I listened to your podcast. I was like, oh, wow. Okay, so I need to adjust some things to see what happens. So sometimes doing it yourself can help you learn. So that's a good thing. But coming back to what I wanted to ask you the question about is the distinctiveness and the importance of distinctiveness in marketing.
Yeah. So the bias around distinctiveness, we have a bias for distinct things. You are more likely to pay a higher amount for an Airbnb that has a distinct feature, whether that's a piano or a stained glass window. You are drawn towards distinct assets. You are drawn towards things that stand out. It's why when you go to the supermarket, red apples are put alongside green apples, and red tomatoes are put alongside green leeks. You know, the fruit and veg is set up in a way to catch your eye, and that's distinctiveness at play. This distinctiveness bias, this bias we have for distinctiveness, is one of many hundreds of biases that humans have to make quicker decision-making processes. So this helps us do things quickly. So if you're scrolling through, I don't know, a review of the top 10 products, the one that is highlighted in bold will catch your eye, and you might go for that sort of very basic way of applying this. What's useful about understanding this bias is then you can apply it to lots of different areas. So you've mentioned applying it to TikTok ads or to something like that. You can apply it in a lot of other areas as well. But let me just talk a little bit about the history of this bias, because I think it's always interesting to understand the science behind it. So it's actually discovered almost 100 years ago by a German researcher called Hedwig von Restorff. And what she did is she gave participants in her study these long lists of different letters, combinations of letters, maybe 4 different combinations of letters, and about 20 of them that they had to remember. And she would ask them at the end, how many of these combinations would you remember? It was really difficult. It's like W-E-R-T, you know, something like that. Really difficult to remember. But within that list of 20 combinations of letters, there would be one combination of numbers, so 5, 7, 2, 4. What she found, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that the numbers were, I think, 30 to 10 times more memorable, 10 to 30 times more memorable. So they stood out. When she repeated the experiment where the numbers were commonplace and the letters were the thing that was distinct and stood out, the same thing happened for the letters. So it was nothing to do with the numbers or letters, it was just when something was distinct. And Richard Shotton, who I referred to earlier, he repeated this experiment back in 2018, so it's a much more recent version, but with brands. He showed people 10 automotive brands, Ford, Chrysler, Land Rover, whatever they are, asked them to remember them. But within those 10 brands, there was one fast food brand, so Burger King. And then when they were asked to recall, unsurprisingly, the fast food brand, the brand that was distinct, stood out. It was 4 times more memorable. The same was the case when he reversed it. So it was more fast food brands and then one automotive brand. Standing out, being distinct, boosts memorability. But what's interesting is so many brands fail to utilize this. So let's take the recent World Cup. The brands that are sponsoring that World Cup, especially in the UK advertising, relatively similar brands that are advertising around that World Cup. It's all beer brands, advertising, gambling firms, the same sort of brands sponsoring the same thing. You're not getting that distinctiveness, you're not standing out. I work in SaaS. A lot of SaaS companies look exactly the same. You go to their websites, they look very similar. My favorite one is if you load up any image of a watch ad, so like an advert for a watch, the time on the watch will always be set to the same time. We want to copy others, so the time is always set around 10 minutes past 10. So there's this real lack of distinctiveness in marketing at the moment, which is irrational because the science says that being distinct helps us stand out. And when you're distinct, you get all these sorts of benefits. So there's this wonderful example of Australia's tax collectors. And what they did is they wanted to get people to basically pay their tax on time. They tried lots of different things. One of the things they tried was just putting a red stamp on the letter saying urgent, and just making the letter a bit more distinct helped Aussies pay an extra $4 million worth of tax on time, saving them a bunch of late fees that they would have got otherwise. In Copenhagen, they painted the bins neon. That reduced littering by 45%, the value of distinctiveness. And, a great example, which again Richard Shotton gives, is of Compare the Meerkat in the UK. This example of an advertisement which is completely distinct, completely different, stood out from its competitors at the time. A lot have copied them since, and that generated an 83% increase in awareness and achieved their 1-year goal, I believe, in around 9 weeks. So this is the idea of distinctiveness. This is bias we have towards distinctiveness. We can apply this to lots of different areas if we know how to use it. And there's an important thing to reference here, which is that we're often told about differentiation. How are you different? This actually suggests something slightly different. You don't need to be completely different. You just need to be distinct. You need to be the unique thing in your category. It doesn't matter if you're a beer brand, but you should probably not advertise at the World Cup because that's where everybody else is. You should probably maybe follow someone like Red Bull's lead and advertise in areas where they're not, like buying out a whole football club or a Formula One car. These are things that big companies can do. Not a great small business example though, so maybe we can talk about that in a bit, but that's the bias of distinctiveness.
Okay, wow. So that's some information there. That's very interesting. And it's good how you can just recall on this information. How did you get to this point where you've got, because I think it's interesting where you can learn something and you're able to give it back in a presentation type way. Because with a lot of my things, I'm very free flowy. Is this something that you'd like to practice regularly? Because marketing, a big part of it is repeating similar things to make sure your audience understand it well. So how did you get to this point?
Yeah, so I do a lot of reading.
Okay.
I read a lot of books, and I read recently about something called the forgetting curve. Have you heard about
Yeah.
this? Yeah, so this is Herman Ebbinghaus. If you look up the forgetting curve on Google, essentially what it is a graph, and he discovered this over 1800s, so a long time ago. It's a graph which shows as soon as you are told something, you have a high recall, but there is a sharp drop off. Here we go. Yeah, this is much better than me explaining it. So if you get the image up, yeah, sharp drop off immediately after you learn about the thing. So when we immediately read something or hear something, when whoever's watching this heard just what I told you, you'll remember it probably until the end of the hour and then forget it relatively quickly. That's the forgetting curve. And then there's a long tail where you remember parts of it for a long time, but it doesn't quite go away. There is basically only one way to get over the forgetting curve, one way to remember things, and it's called spaced repetition. So what you do is, rather than read something once and then don't read it again, you read something once and then read it again at relative, like not massive intervals in terms of time. You don't have to spend a lot of time reading it. You just have to refresh your memory, and that will allow you to actually remember things in the long term. So these examples I've been giving at the start, these are examples that if you've heard me on other podcasts, you will have heard a lot of them before. Like when I'm giving a podcast, I often refer to these examples because they're just top of mind. On my own show, I don't have that. I don't have to fall back on that because I can do my own research and come up with stuff new. So you won't hear that on my own show, but it's stuff I often share on other podcasts. And that's because of that spaced repetition. I'm repeating it a lot of times every month to different people where I can remember it very easy. There's some really cool applications for this though. So, if you as a business owner want to recall something, want to remember something, you are better off spending your time in sort of intervals. So I'll give a different example. Imagine you're learning a language. It's not a good idea to spend 4 hours on a Sunday night practicing Spanish and then not bothering to practice it again for a month. That's a really bad idea. In fact, you won't remember. You won't remember much. You'd be much better off spending 10 minutes on that Sunday night and then 10 minutes every third night for the rest of the month, which would equal less than 4 hours. It would be less of your time, but just doing 10 minutes repeatedly will help you remember far, far more. Actors trying to learn their lines of a script, they're no good if they're going to read that script 10 times the night before they go on stage. They're better off reading it once every night in the 10 days leading up. Same thing for people studying at school. It's the same thing for us marketers. If we want to remember this stuff, we're better off like referring back to it on with this spaced repetition.
Wow. Okay. So I do find myself when I'm listening to podcasts, especially what I do is I've got a mind when I'm listening to a podcast, if they say something interesting, that straight away goes to the top of my list. I'm like, you know what, I need to do that right now. So that
Yeah.
sometimes when I'm listening to your podcast, I'm like, oh my God, he's giving me 5 things that I could be doing. And the way you explain it makes it feel like, okay, that is doable. Because sometimes you hear something, they tell you they've done something, but they never tell you how they got there. And you're like, okay. Whereas finding it in, so what I tend to do is when I'm walking the dog, I'm listening to your podcast as I'm walking the dog every day. So that kind of does the journey there, the journey back. And I'll find tips, but then I'll have to get home and then get my notepad and listen to it again to make sure I get
Yeah.
the points down. But now that
Yeah.
I've found you've got the newsletter, I just sign up to the newsletter because then that way I get the points sent straight to me. So it does help. Well done for doing that. You made it a lot easier because those points coming through are really helpful. And it's always good to be able to get that hit of information. It's like a bit of a nudge in the right
Yeah.
direction, you could say.
Yeah.
But I think you're right about this, and I need to get better at my memory. So it's interesting you mentioned that because I learn something, and if I keep repeating it, like for example, every day I'll repeat my goals that I need to do for this year, and now
Yeah.
they're instilled with me. So if I add a few more things onto that I want to get better at, in a marketing capacity, that works really well because you're marketing yourself, your brand, you've got these things top of mind, and then you're going to remember them in every episode, and they become like second nature. You can easily explain them like you do. And the
Yeah.
good thing about it is over time, you perfect it more and more and more, and it even sounds even better and more impactful. So that's really
Yeah.
impressive. Well done on that.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, that's the USP for podcasts.
Yeah.
Compared to like a course or
Yeah.
a book, which is a one-off thing. Listen to a podcast every week on a similar topic. You'll recall and learn far, far more.
So in marketing land, say for example, I want to up my marketing and I'm a business owner, I've been self-employed, I've moved up to a company level and now I've got a budget. So currently I'm spending quite a lot of money on adverts just to test the waters and see how they're doing. But if someone wanted to get a better opinion on this, is there something you offer or is there something you've worked through that you could suggest? So for example, if I want to spend, I don't know, £1,000 a month for adverts from a tried and tested method, have you got any services that you offer or something that we could help people in this scenario where they can get better results from something you've already done?
Yeah, so I mean, listening to the show is great for that. I also run a course called the Science of Marketing course, and what I do in that course is I break down marketing by different categories, just like we talked about at the start.
Yeah.
Break it down by awareness, consideration, awareness, uh, consideration, acquisition, and retention. And then I showcase different biases that work in each of those different areas. So we mentioned the distinctiveness bias at the moment. There's another bias called the reciprocity bias, which is the idea that we are more likely, we are built into us an inbuilt desire to return the favors of others. So there's this great example by Dennis Reagan, a psychologist who did this study at an art gallery. And at the art gallery, Dennis Reagan would bring in participants and they were given the sort of goal of reviewing the art. That wasn't actually what they were there for. Dennis Reagan didn't tell them, but they said, review the art. This is what the study's about. And in the study, a fellow participant, or who the participant thought was a fellow participant, would come in. This participant was actually Dennis Reagan's assistant helping him out. And in the study, essentially what Dennis Reagan would do is, in some variants of the study, this participant would go out, buy a Coca-Cola from the vending machine, and bring 2 back and say, "Oh, do you want one as well? Like, do you want a Coca-Cola? I just had one spare." And another variance, this sort of assistant of Dennis Reagan, who's pretending to be a participant, would go out and just buy a Coke for themselves. And then after the study was finished, the assistant would say, "Hey, by the way, I'm selling raffle tickets from my local charity. How many tickets would you want to buy?" And what they discovered was when the um, person had given them a Coca-Cola, basically done a little act of kindness, bit of reciprocity, they sold 2 times as many raffle tickets as when they hadn't given any reciprocity. Not maybe a surprise, we all know this, but the more kind you are to people, the more people are likely to reciprocate. Same has been shown by the study by Philip Kunz, which was on Christmas cards, very topical this time of year. He was a researcher who said, I wonder what will happen if I send out 600 Christmas cards to random people who I don't know. Turns out 200 people responded and sent him a Christmas card back. That's the power of reciprocity. And I've used this myself. I wanted people to sign up for the course that I've just mentioned. So what I did is I said, if you sign up for the course and leave a review of Nudge, I'll give you sort of special access. And over 300 people gave me a review of Nudge in order to get access for the course. Whereas if I hadn't have offered that, if I hadn't offered that bit of exchange, that bit of reciprocity, I wouldn't have had that many reviews. So reciprocity is a great bias that can be used for retention. It is a great bias that can be used to keep people coming back from your business. Small variable rewards that you give to your customers, they are more likely to keep people on board. The best car salesman of all time, you can read about him. I'm going to forget his name now, but he sold 13,000 cars in his career. Second-hand car salesman, officially classified by Guinness Book of Records as the best of all time. After he retired, he revealed his secret, and his secret was, I send a card to every single person I do business with, and the card just says, I like you. That's it. And just that is enough to trigger this reciprocity bias and trigger people to do repeat business with him. And he's sold 13,000 cars. There he is, Girard, Joseph Girard,
Yes.
sold 13,001 car
Wow.
in his career. And a lot of that, he says, is down to reciprocity.
That's very interesting. It doesn't take a lot. It's just thinking in the right way, but it's an art in itself, applying something like this to your own business. So, for example, you've given us an example of what you've done and it's worked for you, but trying to get the same thing applied to someone else's business, there's like a bit of a barrier there. So, how do you apply that same logic to, for example, if I'm selling, I don't know, pencils or pens? So as long as you can translate that to your area for working for yourself, then that would be something that would be very valuable. And like you mentioned, there's loads of resources out there and courses that help you through this journey step by step. So it's always good to see that as well. I'm liking this. I like how you explain it, but then you back it up with something as well. So that works very well for different types of mindsets and people that want to see, okay, how will this work for me? So in that same idea, will marketing generate more growth and sales for a small company? So say, for example, they put in some advertising or they look through some of the goals that we want to get to. Will spending more time and more budget on the marketing side of the business generate more growth and sales?
I mean, yes. Yeah. There's lots of evidence that says if you spend money on marketing, you will generate sales. I think, this isn't going to be new to a lot of veteran marketers in the room, but there is obviously different returns on investment you can get depending on how you spend your money. And this is, I think, where psychology comes into play. So there's a wonderful study with basically the scarcity bias, which was done in a supermarket in Ohio. And in this study, they put up big banners across the supermarket, which is marketing. This is what companies would pay for in a supermarket. You can imagine this example if you're a small business owner, perhaps selling something online. You're paying for banners in a supermarket in this scenario, but you could be paying for that for banners on Google. And the banners simply said, buy our cans of Campbell's soup, whatever it was, buy our soup. And what they found was when those banners were visible, people did buy the soup. They bought, I think, like, I'm going to forget it now because I haven't repeated this enough recently, but they bought, like, on average, the actual customers who end up buying the soup would buy 1.5 cans of soup in total. And then they tweaked the banner. So they applied something called the scarcity bias. So this is a bias which all of us know, which is when a resource is scarce, when either it's limited in how much we can buy or there is a time limit on how we can get access to it, our behavior changes and we act with more urgency. It's exactly what happens when tickets to a concert go on sale and we know they might get sold out quickly. It's exactly what happens when prices for an airline ticket are about to go up and you know they're about to go up. You're far more likely to buy. It's exactly what happens around this time of year when you realize you haven't bought presents for your loved ones and you think, oh crap, I need to go out and buy something. Scarcity bias kicks in because you know you've got a time limit.
It's funny you should say that. I've got an Etsy store where I sell custom engraved equipment like office supplies. And the last 3 days, the amount of customers that I've
I
had
bet.
come through saying, "Oh,
I
can we
bet.
buy?" I'm like, you know what? We've got a day, so if you do express postage, I can send it special delivery. But they leave it ultimate last minute, and then they want
Yeah.
it, but then they're paying more for it. So I'm like,
Exactly.
So
Paying
yeah,
more.
very
And this
interesting.
leads perfectly back to this example in the supermarket. So you have a banner saying buy soup, people buy 1.5 cans of soup. If you tweak that message just slightly to showcase a bit of scarcity, and instead put an asterisk there and say limited to 5 cans per customer, But remember, they were only buying 1.5 cans
Yeah.
on average. No one was really buying 5. If you say limited to 5 cans per customer, the amount of sales per customer doubles. And now suddenly people are buying 3 cans instead of 1.5, doubling your ROI, doubling your investment. I can give an example of this, which is actually done with Facebook ads as well, if you like. I love this example. It's with KFC in Australia. Do I have time to talk through this one, Zulf?
We can do, while you're saying this, recently in supermarkets, there's been a thing where people are buying loads of eggs. I don't know what's happening, but they've bought loads of eggs. They've put up a sign saying 3 per customer. Every customer's
Worst
buying,
thing to
they're
do.
buying 3. They're buying 3.
Yeah.
It's like, even if you
It,
don't need 3, they're buying 3. I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? But yeah, let me hear your example, please. The
this
face.
was this was the thing during COVID, right? There
Yeah.
was all these supermarkets want to put limits on how
Yeah.
much people could buy, and all the psychologists were saying that is the worst thing
Yeah.
you can do because people will buy to the limit if you do
Yes.
that. People will buy to the limit anyway. So this example with a Facebook ad, because I think this is probably more relevant to your audience, is done with KFC. And KFC in Australia had this wonderful deal, chips for $1. So they had this chips for $1 deal, and they wanted to see how they could create this deal and message it and talk about it in a way in Facebook ads that would encourage people to click through and make a delivery on their delivery app of choice, Delivery, Uber Eats, whatever it will be. Chips for $1 was the offer. And KFC spend $3 billion on advertisement each year. This is their parent brand, Yum, whatever they're called. That spends $3 billion on advertisements each year. So they have some very smart copywriters working for them. And they asked these copywriters, come up with the best thing you can think of, the best line for this offer. And they came up with all sorts of wonderful things. They said, chips for $1, you've never seen the Colonel so generous. From Perth to Brisbane, their life loved Australia around. All this wonderful copy. And a few of them came up with a few psychology-inspired lines as well. And in total, they had 90 different variants of this copy. They created 90 different Facebook ads, put the same spend behind each one, and could then see which of these ads is most successful. The one that was most successful, just like the supermarket study, simple scarcity. It said chips for $1, limited to 4 chips per customer. That, out of all of the different messages, was the one that drove the most sales, the most clicks, the most people to deliver. And the point here being studying the psychology behind how people make decisions isn't just sort of useful in understanding when somebody has made a decision, why they've made that decision. It's extremely useful in helping you ideate and think of different ways to encourage people to make those decisions. So when you are thinking about creating your next TikTok ad or Facebook ad, rather than going in with a bit of a blank slate and thinking, oh, I could try this, or maybe I could use that, you can say, no, today we're going to test out scarcity, or today we're going to test out distinctiveness, or today we're going to test out anchoring, or whatever else it might be, and try those against each other, because you're not making decisions based on gut instinct. In that case, you're making decisions based on hard evidence and science, which, as we all know, is a much smarter way to make decisions.
So is this a time-sensitive thing? Has this worked for years? Because I'm thinking you can use this at any point. It's not like there's no shelf date on this type of offer where you have scarcity as your main objective. So that's like a win-win situation. If it's always working, it's like a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, like scarcity for a lot of businesses is used year round. Luxury brands are scarcity brands. There's a restaurant near me which is created by. Do you remember Salt Bay? He's in the news a lot at the moment because he was at the World Cup and he shouldn't have been. Salt Bay is the guy who did this. It was a bit of
Oh,
a
okay,
meme,
okay, yeah.
and he has created a restaurant in near Hyde Park in London, a mile or so away from me. And this restaurant is renowned for being just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The price of a steak there, or at least one of their steaks, is £1,500. People often walk away with bills in tens of thousands of pounds of a bill. And the irrational thing is this food is objectively not that good. Everybody knows you can have a better experience for less money. I mean, I think you can have better experience for a 1,000th of the money, but at least for 100th. You can really buy better quality food. So why do people go here? Why do people spend this much money? It's down to scarcity. What rich people experience, these are very, very wealthy people experience, is a lack of, or no, not a lack of, a feeling of total abundance. Nothing in their life is scarce. They can buy anything they want. They want to go to a Michelin star restaurant, they can go. If they want to go get a lovely meal delivered, they can get it, and it's no real cost because they're very, very wealthy. So restaurants exist near Hyde Park in Kensington, opposite Harrods in London, because they offer the top 0.1% that feeling of scarcity. So Scarcity can be your whole business model in that scenario. For other businesses, it might not be something you want to use as often, because if you overuse scarcity, booking.com being a good example, you can sort of erode the trust of your customers. So if you are, say you're selling a company that sells courses or webinars, if you're constantly telling people that this is limited, that it's running out, that's a time offer, and people catch up with this, you can sort of erode that trust. You can definitely overuse these biases so they lose their appeal and they lose their salience,
Like
especially if it's not a core part of your business. Go on, yeah.
DFS. Have you seen DFS? Always a sale on.
Oh yeah.
I'm like,
Oh yeah. We'll all be watching the DFS ads in January thinking, oh, okay, here we go again.
But yeah, I think coming back to the question I asked you was about, will marketing generate growth for sales? It's a straightforward answer of yes, it will. But the only reason I asked that was a lot of people don't give marketing the attention it deserves. They'll make a newer, fancier product and spend more money investing in making it, but they won't spend more or enough money marketing it. So if you're currently working for yourself, think about your current structure of your business and what you're doing and set a little bit of money aside towards marketing, even if it means testing a couple of ads to see what happens. Listen to a couple of the Nudge podcasts to give you an idea of like how you set AdWords in terms of the wording and what works, and it'll give you a great example of what examples work. I'll link one of the episodes in the show notes. You can actually go directly to that episode to hear it, because that's one that I really liked when I was listening to it. I want to touch on one. Have you had a freeze there? So as we were talking about that session, I think it's interesting to look at some of the points you mentioned, because I've heard you've told 10,000 people not to listen to your podcast. What's that all about?
Yeah, so in order to explain that, as always, I think you have to understand the psychology behind why on earth you would do that. Why on earth would you tell people not to listen to your podcast? That sounds completely irrational. One of the reasons you might do it is because there is a very interesting bias in psychology called the pratfall effect. This bias was discovered by a researcher called Elliot Aronson back in the 1960s. And he set up these studies where he would film an actor answering quiz questions correctly. So in the study, the actor would answer quiz questions with incredible accuracy, getting 94% of them right. You really would look like a genius. But there were variants of how he would do this recording. So in some variants, the actor would answer all these questions, look incredibly bright, and walk off stage. In another variant, the actor would answer all these questions, look incredibly bright, and then spill coffee down themselves, look a little bit clumsy,
Okay.
showcase a little bit of a weakness, and then walk off stage. And what Aronson discovered when showing these different recordings of the actors to groups of participants was that participants consistently rated the actor who spilt coffee down himself as more likable. Showcasing a flaw alongside intelligence, competence is a good way of building your likability. And there are some interesting follow-up studies with this. So Jo Sylvester at Cardiff University, she recruited dozens and dozens of people to go for job interviews, people who all were from the same demographic background, looked similar, and they were given the exact same CV and the exact same experience. The only unique difference between these people they were told to when they were applying for these jobs, they weren't actually going for the jobs, by the way, they were like research participants, but they went for real jobs, and they found that when they went for these jobs, the research assistants who revealed a flaw, a weakness in the interview process, were actually more likely to get invited back to the next round of interviews and to go further on the interview process, which again seems irrational. You would imagine that you would have more success as an interviewee if you hid your flaws and instead just showcased as many of your positives as possible. But Jo Sylvester found the opposite was true. If you highlight a flaw, you can basically be viewed as more competent and go further on in the stage. And there's some examples of how you can apply this in marketing. There's some great marketing by folks like Marmite, who say you either love us or you hate us. There's some great examples from Avis, who say we're second, so we try harder. These examples of highlighting a flaw alongside a benefit. So what I did with my Reddit ad is I created two variants. One of the Reddit ads said, you should listen to Nudge Podcast, and then gave 5 reasons why. Loads of 5-star reviews, it's 20 minutes, packed 10. You'll learn the psychology behind marketing, that sort of stuff. I then created a variant, which was inspired by the pratfall effect. It said, you shouldn't listen to Nudge Podcast. And then some sort of positive yet negative bullet points. So I wasn't just saying you shouldn't listen to Nudge Podcast because it's crap. I was saying you shouldn't listen to Nudge Podcast because you'll understand why all the LinkedIn gurus are wrong. You'll get a headache from all the great content that'll be shared. You'll you'll become the annoyance of your friend because you'll understand more about psychology than them. These sort of tongue-in-cheek positive/negatives, like the love it or hate it Marmite application. I tested out these two different ads, and I found essentially that the pratfall version had a 4 times higher click-through rate, 4 times more people clicked on that ad versus the standard message, which was fascinating for me because it's totally irrational. You would think by saying don't listen to this podcast, people wouldn't listen, but the opposite is true. Triggers this obviously distinctiveness. People don't usually read that, so they click through and read, but then also increases likability and trust. You sort of think, well, if this person's highlighting some flaws or like suggesting they're not perfect, maybe this is something worth checking out. And just like the actor who increased their likability by spilling coffee down themselves, I think I increased the amount of people who listen to my podcast by saying, here are some reasons why you shouldn't.
Okay, wow. So would you find that the Reddit audience is slightly different to other audiences as in terms of your adverts?
I don't know. I only tested it on Reddit. The reason being is that I just think it's a really easy place to run ad campaigns. It's especially good because people subscribe to different subreddits, which makes it really easy to target marketers, to target people who are interested in marketing. If you subscribe to a number of subreddits like marketing, growth hackers, indie hackers, marketing growth, entrepreneurship, you're probably going to be the sort of person who will listen to a marketing podcast. That's why I chose Reddit.
And did you just use the in Reddit dashboard for adverts? Nothing like
Yeah.
okay. And did you link anything to that to monitor the clicks back, or was it just everything within Reddit?
Yeah, so I use a tool called Chartable for my podcast,
Okay.
which does lots of things. But one of the things they can create is smart links, which will measure how many people click on the link, but then also how many people go and listen to the episode and become a subscriber and what episodes they listen to as well. So I could see clearly not only that people were 4 times more likely to click, that people were actually far more likely to listen to the podcast, become a subscriber, and to listen to many more episodes as well for the same amount of spend.
Oh wow, that would be very helpful. So I'm currently on that journey where I'm doing the adverts. So Chartable, is that something you link in like an analytics tool that just links in between the advert?
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah. So Chartable is analytics for your podcast, but also can create these short links, which you can use to measure how many people actually click on the link and become a podcast listener. Really, really important if you're doing advertising for your
Yes.
podcast.
Yeah. I think as I'm at the starting of that journey, it's nice to know what you're using because then it gives me an idea of how I can fit that in with my stuff. Okay, that sounds good. Now, say for example, someone listening right now is in this journey and they're thinking about maybe upping their marketing with their current setup and they're not really using or utilizing that. Is there any quick tips that you think would be a good starting point for someone to look at to generate more, well, not advertising, but more flow in their process to get more people into them?
Mm. It's very hard to give those sort of tips without the
Yeah.
context of what they're doing.
So if you were starting a
I,
new company, what would be the first thing
yeah,
that you would do in terms of marketing wise? Which areas would you focus on maybe?
yeah, I think I'd say positioning. So this is probably even not necessarily psychology, although it does link, but you really need to nail your positioning. You need to be clear about what your company offers, who it's for, what the benefits are, and how it differentiates from your competitors. I'd probably advise that person to read the book Obviously Awesome by April Dunford. It's this incredible book which details how you can create compelling positioning for your company. But importantly, it will force you to answer some of these crucial questions around why would somebody use my product over a competitor? And if you can answer that question, you can then say, well, okay, how can I showcase this? So I'll give a positioning example that I love. It's of a company that I've followed since sort of their inception. It's a company called Loom, and Loom, like Zoom, allow you to create, well, not like Zoom, but they allow you to create these short video recordings of yourself, of your screen. Um, as soon as you hit end on the recording, it will generate a unique link with that video that you can send to someone else in your team, and they can then leave comments and respond. So a very quick way to share an update with your team without having to meet in person. Now, the obvious way that a founder of a company like this might advertise that company is to say, oh, we have HD recording. Oh, we let you record in 1080p. You can record 10 gigabytes worth of video. you can access it via our browser extension. Now, what's the problem with talking about it that way? You're talking about it from the company's point of view. You're saying, here's why the company is great. Here's everything I've built as a founder, and I think you should like that because I do. And what positioning and reading books like April Dunford force you to do is to instead think about it from the customer's point of view or the user's point of view. What would make them want to use this product? And that's what Loom did successfully from day one, which is why they are now well ahead of most of their competitors, is they basically spun up their messaging completely around the customer benefit. Rather than saying we have HD recording and lots of gigabytes, they say, don't waste time in meetings anymore. Kill all the meetings that you have in your day and spend time doing the thing that you want. And they all throughout their marketing, they say a 5-minute Loom can remove a 60-minute meeting. A 5-minute Loom is faster than typing a 2-page long email. And it's this great understanding of actually what customers want to achieve. They want a life which is meeting free. They want a life where they have more time to do the things that matter. That's how Loom positions themselves. And you can totally imagine a world where they wouldn't have done that positioning, but they also wouldn't have been as successful. So focus on positioning. That would be my advice for a small business starting up.
Thank you. That's very useful. And that mentality reminds me of the Simon Sinek video. Have you seen that old one where he kind of talks about the why and like how Apple do it? So that resonates with that. Thank you. I want to say thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure having you on. It's been great kind of delving into your mind and getting some of my questions answered. And I think because my audience are similar, they'll have these same type of questions. So some of these will be regular things that I always hear and see in comments. So I will link to one of your podcast episodes in the show notes and the podcast itself, just to give the audience an idea of that, especially that Reddit advert what you did. I really found that interesting, like how you found it and the results and then having that there. What's next for you? So what's going on? Are you happy what you're doing, or have you got big things coming up soon?
Yeah, great question. I love my job at the moment. I'm at a wonderful company called Buffer. If anybody listening needs to schedule posts on social media, Buffer is the tool for you. It's completely free for the first 3 channels you connect. You can schedule all your social media content, get back to the things you love. Note the use of good positioning there. So really enjoying my time there. And I love creating podcasts. For me, my goal is to create the best quality podcast I can possibly do. So I want to up the amount of research I do, up the amount of support I have.
Wow.
I want to get to the stage where
I think you're there. I think because when I listen,
I want to go beyond, man.
When I listened to it, I was like, oh my God, he must have spent a lot of. How much do you typically spend in terms of time on each episode, like researching? Because everything's just very polished. The information's what I want. It's what I need. Nothing more, nothing less. And even like the bits where some of them you'll be like, oh, I'm going over to a short advert or a sponsor segment. I like the fact that you tell us, you give like the audience, okay, I'm going to give it. Whereas other ones, they blend it in and you can't really tell. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm listening to an advert. So I like how you positioned it, especially for my ears anyway. So it worked well. So you're doing it right, I think, definitely. Well done.
Cheers, mate. Yeah. I don't know how long I spend. In terms of actually creating the show, it's very quick. I guess the time is spent on research, and that's just an hour a night reading or something like that. Like it's very difficult to conceptualize that, but yeah, I love it. I want to create better podcasts. That's my goal.
Are you gonna go video soon? Podcast with video. Is that something you're thinking about or no?
Almost impossible to do if you're a scripted show, which I am. The show has to be scripted in order to get it down to 20 minutes and cut the fluff. So it's very, very difficult to do without hiring an expert to help you out. And so the audio files are on YouTube if you want to watch them.
Yeah, I saw them with the little waveform, isn't it?
Yeah, like it's there. I at the moment, no. I think if you want to be perfect at something, if you want to be great at something, you've got to know what to say no to.
Yeah.
And for a podcast is audio first. I know there's benefits to publishing on YouTube, especially for discoverability. But my goal isn't discoverability at the moment. It's to create the best business podcast that people can listen to. And to do that, I have to say no to a load of things, which includes creating good videos on YouTube.
Wow, that's quite inspiring. Well done. Because I kind of feel like I'm still at that point where I'll do everything everywhere. I'm still honing in what's the best thing and then focus on that. But it looks like you've got that narrowed down. You're already focused and you know what you want to do. Because if you've got a goal, that's basically more or less the whole task done. So you stick to it until you get to it, and you will get there. You're already a big position of it there, listening to how it's going. Man. So thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate you coming on the show. I will be putting show notes below so you can actually pick up the podcast link, which will be all the podcast nudge, as well as the show notes for today's episode, and a direct link to one of the episodes that I really liked. There'll be a link there to the Teachable course as well for the marketing side of things, so you can actually get a bit of information there. I want to say thank you for joining me on zulftalks.com.